All right, Nicaragua is a trending topic on Twitter today, and the issue that we are seeing is the Nicaragua's release of 135 political prisoners that they have released into Guatemala in a deal brokered by the United States State Department. And I don't know that Nicaragua is going to be on many people's radar. It's a tiny country just in between Honduras and Guatemala, and Costa Rica, south of Mexico. And many Americans probably have heard about it, especially if they were alive to remember the Sandinista revolution and during the Reagan administration. But Nicaragua has long been resisting American imperialism, and we've also seen recently in the news a lot of mentions of Venezuela gangs in Denver, Venezuela gangs in Chicago, the the supposed uh, the supposed election, um, the supposed rigged election in Venezuela with Nicolas Maduro, and that recently took place there about a month ago. And I guess last week also we saw the United States seized a Venezuelan jet that was for the leaders of Venezuela, and it was seized in the Dominican Republic. So I wanted to dig into some of uh, some of the, I don't know, broader diplomatic and American imperialism context of what's going on here.
Yeah,
Granted,
my only recollection of Nicaragua was of this guy. I remember Oliver North somehow being involved in some kind of a missile something or other that happened, but like I was super young when this was occurring, so Nicaragua to me is just this opaque place, and I don't have a good sense of it. I think a lot of Americans probably don't have a good sense of a lot of different countries unless they've actually been there. You know, you have this lens that you get through TV or movies, and I would liken this to something like our perception of Russia. Like what is most people's perception of Russia? It's probably like, oh, they saw that part on Stranger Things or whatever at Netflix, and they think of frozen Siberia. But if you see pictures of St. Petersburg or whatever the beaches that are in Russia, it gives you a vastly different perception of the place. So if you haven't been there, you probably don't know anything about it. I haven't been to Nicaragua, so I don't know anything about it really. It's just, yeah, it's right by Costa Rica, right? So I'd imagine it's pretty similar, but maybe it's vastly different. You've been there, right, Lucas?
yeah, I've been there a couple of times, 2009 to about 2012. Um, I spent quite a bit of time in Costa Rica and Nicaragua. So the first time that I went to Nicaragua, I told my family here in the United States that I was planning on going to Nicaragua, and my parents and everybody else who got wind of it, there was a wringing of hands and gnashing of teeth, and I said, "How bad could it be?" And I will be wary. It seemed inconceivable to me at the time that everybody would go to Costa Rica, and Costa Rica could be so um, could be, like a wonderful paradise, and yet nobody would go explore Nicaragua. So I went to San Juan del Sur and Lake Nicaragua, sort of all over the southern side of the country.
Would
Great.
would you say that they're roughly equivalent? So if somebody's been to Costa Rica, would you say that it's like similar terrain, type of climate, jungles and whatever? That was my sense, is that they're
Well,
close
similar
to.
terrain. Maybe pull up a map of Nicaragua if you would. There's a massive lake in the middle of Nicaragua. Uh, we have the Panama Canal, and we're going to get into some geopolitical history of the area. But a lot of the tension between Nicaragua both um, goes back to, let's say, before the United States existed. There was a and when Spanish interest controlled much of the area, That little nub that you see there between Honduras and Nicaragua was called the Miskito Coast. And Miskito, there were some
Wasn't there
ships.
was some movie about that? Wasn't there? The Mosquito Coast? God, I
Oh
recall
Lord,
something like that.
now I don't know about that, but I would like to see it if it were, because it's a great story. I put a link up also of the Mosquito Coast and the Miskito people. Mosquito actually refers to a people, and they resisted.
Hey,
Um,
well, there you go. It's got Harrison Ford in it, man. That's
no way.
awesome.
Well, look at
And Helen Mirren in her prime. So okay, you missed this one.
this is the real story behind Star Wars. Um, so uh, George Lucas probably ripped all of this off and
No, no, come on. This came later.
put it on a wall.
1977 was Star Wars, so this was well after.
Yeah, well, the history happened before, like after the fact. Harrison was like, George Lucas, he actually did Star Wars off of the Mosquito Coast. Um, and I say that because it's a great story of a group of people who band together to fight the big empire. The empire of that time not being the United States empire, but being the Spanish and British empires. And Britain certainly helped a little bit with like some people might say, why do they speak English in Belize and yet they speak Spanish in Guatemala, Honduras, and Nicaragua, Costa Rica, and everywhere else? And that goes to Britain trying to fight for a toehold in the region. But Britain had also had the New England states. But as you got south into, why do we have Florida? Um, why do we have French names like Louisiana? That was because at the onset of imperialism, there were different Western European holds on various parts of the Americas. But
Well, and why is there this dashed line on the Belize border and everything else is a hard line? Like, what does that mean? Do you know
uh,
that?
well, that's going to mean it's a disputed border, and so I would imagine that Guatemala claims. I don't know the true story there, but if I were to guess, I would say that Guatemala claims Belize, and Belize is like a corporation carve out of the United Kingdom. But I don't know about that. But
Anyway, back to Nicaragua. So there's this big lake in the middle, the Mosquito Coast. We're not talking about the movie with Harrison Ford. If you've watched that, something else.
Well, and yeah, the Mosquito Coast and the Mosquito people. So there were some slaving ships that were taken over, landed on the Mosquito Coast, and became an independent nation there, that were the Mosquito people, and resisted Spanish rule for quite some time. And so that kind of gives you an idea. I think there's something like, yeah, there's 500,000 Mosquito people today, and the majority of them, 90%, live in Nicaragua. And when you're in Costa Rica, like, they call themselves the Ticos, and they refer to the Nicaraguan people as the Nicos. And there's, in our minds, we might think like of like they're all Mexican people, or no, there's very distinct differences when you get down there. And even whatever, I'm going off on a tangent. So the I guess the political history of Nicaragua is one that leans heavily towards independence. There is a massive lake in Nicaragua, and there are not huge mountains that create the continental divide. Like, if you're familiar with the Panama Canal, you know that you enter the Panama Canal in the Caribbean, you go through a series of locks, you get up to a high mountain lake that's maybe 1,000 feet over sea level. I'm not sure how much it goes up in elevation, but then takes you back down and drops you down, and you go through Panama City over on the Pacific Ocean. And people might wonder why Nicaragua, or Lake Nicaragua, was not chosen. Well, it was chosen, and there were both issues with the sandiness of the area, the mosquitoes, and malaria. The French originally tried to build a canal through Lake Nicaragua, and were unsuccessful in doing so, and that was exacerbated by the independent nature of the people who were living in the area. So so we have the Panama Canal, like pushed forward by Teddy Roosevelt, who took over from the French, and and Teddy Roosevelt also was the beginning of progressive era republicanism in and just the progressive era in the United States, and American imperialism. I don't know if you're familiar with his line, "Speak softly and carry a big stick." Well, he carried a big shovel too, and that led to the Panama Canal. But I bring up also I bring up the Lake Nicaragua because and pull up a picture of, you would. There's a beautiful island in the middle of Lake Nicaragua. You can take ferries out to the island, and it's called Ometepe Island, and there are two volcanoes. One volcano is active; it belches smoke all day. There's a beautiful road that goes all the way around the island. Um, if you zoom into the island, it's sort of like it looks like a figure eight because of the two volcanoes sort of merged together. Yep, there you go. The more southern mountain you can hike all the way up to the top of. There's a little tiny lake in the center of it. It's a it's a beautiful place to visit. There's the Solomon Islands that are further south there too, which um, anyway, if you see the river that leads out right on the border of Costa Rica, that's also hotly disputed territory, and it has everything to do with I don't know, American imperialism, older regional tensions, but also the Chinese have been courting heavily Nicaragua, and looking to put their own canal in right there, and they don't have any mountains to go through. You dig a you can imagine a modern equipment digging a canal over on the eastern side into the Caribbean and over on the Pacific, and there are no mountains in between. So it's not that large of a project, and China and other countries in the world have long looked at the American association with the Panama Canal and the control they have over ocean traffic because of that canal, and look to possibilities with Nicaragua. So that probably goes to so you mentioned earlier the first that you knew about it was the Sandinista, and Oliver North, and the American coups that were going on in the 80s. And the president of Nicaragua today is Daniel Ortega, and it was he who came to power fighting the American coups sponsored by the CIA, and the likes of Oliver North back in the 80s. So, any questions for me at this point?
No, I'm following along. So now we've got the geography, we've got the figure eight, Ollie North, Nicaragua, mosquitoes. There's nothing to do with the Mosquito Coast, the movie. Okay, yeah, I'm following it.
Yeah, well, there are a bunch of mosquitoes there. I'll tell you that. Some
I just
beautiful.
can't imagine it's the same at all, man. I think it's just kind of a lark. It was a joke. Like it's spelled differently. One is like the Peoples. I don't think that.
No, it's that's those spellings are just like the various, like the French or English or
Is that
Spanish.
is that the onomatopoeia? Is that what that is?
Well, I mean, you'll come across, like the uses of K's or the uses of Q's or the uses of X's. We talked about Cheech Love the other day, but it's just different ways of spelling the same words. Um, so anyway, but that sort of like puts us in a perspective of how Nicaragua is viewed throughout the world, and also some of its relationships with especially Honduras. Guatemala is and southern Mexico, the Yucatan, are sort of like old centers of Mayan culture, and are a little bit more distinct. By the way, the food in Nicaragua, Costa Rica, very different than if you're expecting like spicy American food. You put pepper on an empanada there, they'll look at you with a raised eyebrow and say that's too hot. Um, so, uh, but anyway, so what's happening recently is Daniel Ortega has been very vociferously complaining about American interference that still goes on in well, all over South America and Central America, but especially lately in Venezuela um, with the shenanigans that have been going on. And when I say shenanigans, it's you know, you know do we need to get into the history of Venezuela? I should say in short, we've talked about the amount of oil reserves that Venezuela has and how the United States has long been very interested in those Venezuelan oil reserves. And long story short, Hugo Chavez came into power in a leftist revolution maybe 20 years ago. And his successor is because he died, he passed away maybe 5, 6 years ago, and his successor is a man named Nicolas Maduro. And Maduro Maduro was recently reelected, and the line of the United States, the United States blob, to pick up from Mike Penz's term, I really like, but and by blob he means the associated interest of the Department of Justice, the State Department, and the CIA, has been to try to delegitimize that election, and that election may or may not be legitimate, but it certainly seems suspicious when the United States has an outsized interest in the resources of the area and a long history with political interference. And I can say when I was in Nicaragua, Daniel Ortega was hugely popular, and Nicaragua was a poor country. In fact, I believe it was Nicaragua and Haiti were the two poorest countries in the Western Hemisphere at the time, if I remember correctly. But but generally, the people that I spoke to there were happy. They really liked their life. They liked their culture. When I was on Ometepe Island, I was there for quite a while, and I actually stayed with a man who had grown up in Los Angeles and had been deported back to Nicaragua back in the late the late 2000s. I'm sorry, the early 2000s, late 90s. So we I don't know. We talked a little bit about Daniel Ortega, his popularity, his legitimacy at the time, but. Uh, anyway, so Daniel Ortega has long been a thorn in the side of the United States because he represented, when we say leftist in South and Central America, generally that means anti-American imperialism. And when we hear those nations discussed by media organizations and like State Department blob organizations who are looking to interfere with that might be a discussion about the poverty or the illegitimacy in the region. So and be on the lookout for words like aggression and democracy, because oftentimes that delegitimization narrative gets couched in language of, was their election democratic, and presumes in a way a United States authority in asserting, whether that leader is, I don't know, authoritarian or what have you, is legitimate because like they were democratically elected. But
Yeah, and I think in times past we maybe had more of a legitimacy in calling into question various elections and whatever, but probably that started to fade as our CIA has been notoriously implicated in the overthrow of multiple governments, right? I mean, I don't know that the U.S. really has the right to say some elections legitimate or not anymore, right?
Absolutely. And I think this has, this again calls into question like the authority of American, democratic ideals um, was it held a lot more sway whenever we both gave refuge to people whose local governments or local regions were being autocratic, mean, or undemocratic. But it's a whole nother thing to go into a country and uh, and presume to create and manipulate that state.
Do you catch when John Boehner, wasn't it John Boehner that went on the news and said, "Yeah, I overthrow a whole bunch of countries. I would know because I'm the one that did it." Did you catch
That
that?
that was you're thinking of John Brennan, who was one of the directors of the CIA. It may
No,
have been
no, it's
or John Bolton. I think it was John.
Bolton. Bolton, you're right, Bolton. That's what it was. Yeah,
Yeah,
no.
well, I mean, there's and when we talk about sort of like what's going on in the United States today, the uniparty, the convergence of the Democratic and Republican parties, the neocons, the MAGA revolt against the neocons, that has a lot to do with about it being politically expedient to go out and coerce the rest of the world to use the power of the United States military to make things cheaper here. And all the presidents of the United States since even before Reagan, I mean, like in the wake of World War II, using I mean the arm twisting that the FDR administration did to get the to make the dollar the world's reserve currency was merely setting the stage and giving us more tools than just navy ships and army bases throughout the world to assert American authority all over the world. So
So,
yeah, John.
this directly ties in because you wanted to talk about Venezuela as well, and actually, this clip was referencing what was going on in Venezuela. He said January 6th was not a coup, but what we did in Venezuela was.
Absolutely. I mean, John Bolton. I'm very disgusted with John Bolton. He believes in like the infinite um, the infinite power and might of the United States, and even like maybe even to dial that back to. I think we mentioned Kennedy earlier. If not, we did before the show. I don't know if you saw Kennedy's latest campaign ad that talks about um, it talks about T.H. White's The Once and Future King, The Sword and the Stone, and the ideas behind it as to whether might makes right or right makes right. And that book was written after the First World War and leading into the Second World War, and was very much bringing a topic forth that was on everybody's mind with regards to whether we wanted to continue sort of like ideals of imperialism and colonialism in sending armies and militaries around the world. And part of the world exchange system, um, part of that idea was to get away uh, from military battles or I don't know, fighting between the various countries of the world, and to use commerce to create relationships and communication between these various countries, and I think was well intentioned and part of the future of the world, but was subverted by the United States insertion of the dollar in place of the international currency, the Bancor, at that time. So yes, John Bolton here is, and John Bolton was a massive like neocon. I mean, think back also to the Bush era. Uh, did Iraq or Afghan did Iraq? um, I mean, we're still not totally sure what happened with 9/11, but we are sure that there was no Nigerian yellow cake in Iraq and no weapons of mass destruction, but there was oil. How'd my oil get underneath your sand? Um, as the joke went at the time.
There
And
was also a massive amount of gold. Didn't we have our soldiers posing with all the gold that they were seizing from Saddam Hussein?
absolutely, and also think back, to in 2008, whenever there was the Arab Spring, did we send American troops into Tunisia or to Morocco or to Egypt? No, we sent them into Libya. What had Libya been doing that was different than all the rest? I mean, Libya both had more oil than, say, Tunisia. Um, and maybe all the rest, but had also been selling that oil and not been taking in United States dollars, but been taking in gold. And it was very threatening to the United States to think that they were not going to have the tools of control, like sanctioning. And notice, like, whenever we seized the Venezuelans playing in the Dominican Republic recently, and Daniel Ortega, and Nicolas Maduro and several other leaders, like, called it out for piracy, and they said you had no right to do so. We bought this plane, and the United States said, well, you shouldn't have had any money anyways, because like, all the money in the world is the American dollar, and we sanctioned you. So how did you get those dollars? You must have laundered them. It's like somebody sits down to a game of Monopoly, and the United States is presumed to be the banker, and turns and says, "Well, you can't buy that property because, well, you weren't supposed to get money from your neighbors. You're supposed to get money from the bank."
Well, and this has been one of the criticisms I think that's been leveled against the United States is that it's weaponized the dollar against the rest of the world, and it's a lot of countries have said this is what's been forcing us into doing something like BRICS.
Absolutely, and this is also why anyone who hears a politician repeating, and Trump, Harris, and Kennedy have all said, "Oh, we're going to." Uh, I'm committed to keeping the dollar as the world reserve currency. Well, unless we're going to send American military into every country of the world, then that's an empty political promise. And either they're lying to their teeth to us, or they don't understand. They don't they don't understand money. Period. And certainly not. I don't know, international diplomacy. The United States needs to be going forth with an understanding that the United States dollar is not, demonstrably not, going to be the world reserve currency going forward, and that they can do nothing about that. And the sooner that the United States um, begins to grapple with that and make plans to deal with that, the better. Because having the dollar as the world reserve currency has also been devastating to 90% of Americans, because it is the main reason that we have seen the growth of the financial mirage economy that we see today. Because it's another, there's an understanding that the United States, like, takes from the rest of the world, like, robs from Africa and South America and Central America, but we didn't originally set this system up to do so. What we set the system up to do was to secure markets to sell surplus United products that we had in the United States. And so think back to the Great Depression and what actually occurred in the Great Depression, because part of the Milton Friedman um, narrative, the Friedman Schwartz narrative, was that there was a lack of money in the world. And but in reality, well, there was a lack of money, but we had a surplus of goods, and prices were collapsing. And so we've seen I mean, think back to the responses of FDR's administration uh, before the New Deal. What they had been doing was, they had been burning fields of crops. They had been slaughtering herds of animals, and we have this narrative that people were starving at the time. Well, they weren't starving because there was famine. They were starving because there were class distinctions, there was inequality here in the United States, and people couldn't figure out a way to exchange goods. And so part of that response going forward with the creation of the world exchange system coming out of World War II, and think also about the narrative of how the world created, a sudden demand, but also a sudden opening up of trade. Whereas we had been isolationist before World War II and wouldn't send like American goods and American products around the world, all of a sudden it was okay to send boatloads of munitions, planes, food, and clothing to Western European countries. And so going forth with that idea, part of the American political regime's understanding of world trade was to secure markets in foreign countries. So whenever there was a surplus of goods in the United States, we could have somebody turn around and sell them to. And through over time, and especially in the wake of the Nixon shock, we talked about that, how we'd been inflating dollars against our actual gold holdings. We became addicted to creating dollars and sending them to the rest of the world, and the power, the abuse of the ignorance of countries and people all around the world. We became addicted to that, and so now it's we have seen the growth of lobbies and the inability of politicians to exert control. We elect all these people to go, quote unquote, drain the swamp, and in reality, we are electing politicians that go to Washington and get paid off to bend their necks to the various whims of large corporations and multinational corporations. So go ahead, Grant.
No, I was like, okay, and maybe how does this tie back to Nicaragua again? How is this trying to bring us back?
Well, so Nicaragua, like this also there's a religious aspect of this too, but I mean, how does this tie back to Nicaragua? Well, it ties back both with
because Nicaragua is not part of BRICS, is it? They haven't joined that or anything like that. This is they're resisting in a slightly different way, but not necessarily in a monetary way, right?
Well, so we talk all the time about BRICS, but even leading into BRICS, there was the concept of the SUR, SUR, which means South in Spanish, and the SUR, like BRICS is an acronym made by American financial interests that were creating hedge fund or creating funds, ETFs, whatever. Financial instruments that were investing American dollars. Like how do we pour dollars throughout the world? We don't just send them to the State Department to write a check with our quote unquote foreign aid, but the bulk of them go through both NGOs, through churches, and through corporations. And so BRICS was American dollars that were being invested into various countries: Brazil, Russia, India, China. But in the financial collapse of 2008, 2009, BRICS was one of the hot sectors that people are investing money in. And just like in the Great Depression, we had a retraction of cash because when your stock portfolio says $400,000 one day, and then you wake up the next day and it says $300,000, the cash magically disappeared. And that's what happened to on a very large level in 2008 and 2009. But the United States was insulated because a lot of the cash that disappeared in countries like Brazil, Russia, India, China, and I forget what the S is. And whenever there's a cash suddenly disappears, liquidity suddenly disappears, that's whenever you have political distress. And so those are the countries that were most hurt by the financial collapse of 2008, 2009, and it became more readily, more politically expedient, more important to get off the United States dollar, because they began to understand, when there is a financial collapse, they're going to get hurt the most because they are because money is a political phenomenon, and they are far out. They are far from the political association and the political control of the United States. And Nicaragua and South America had long been there. There were ideas of getting off the United States, out of United States control, in the wake of the coups that the CIA and the State Department have long asserted on their countries. And so there's been the idea of the SUR that was floated by Brazil. Brazil had huge problems with the real back in the 90s. They restarted their currency. We know a lot about Argentina's like pegging and unpegging of the dollar and the inflation that's created, the massive debt that they have to the IMF, which is the World Bank IMF system is the institutions we created, the banks that we created to lend money to the rest of the world and to create that global market for American goods that we have flipped. And so Nicaragua has long been part of those. Nicaragua has been sanctioned and outside of the United States dollar system, just like Cuba, just like Venezuela, and think also about El Salvador. Like in the crypto world, there's a lot of fascination with El Salvador's choice to get off the dollar by using Bitcoin, and hopes and an understanding of what that might mean for El Salvador. So Nicaragua has long been a part of that. But when we think about the other levers of state control that exist outside of the dollar and outside of the military, it goes to the church. And I also brought up immigration. They're part of the immigration problem of the United States. We have heard the narrative of a lot of these people who are crossing in from Mexico are not actually from Mexico, and not even anymore from Honduras, Guatemala, and some of these countries that are below the borders of Mexico. And if you were paying attention a couple of months ago, you would have seen that there were two commercial airliners that were full of 400 people from India, and India had been deporting, and think again also to the political instability that has risen up in India in the wake of the financial distress from reeling from the impacts of 2008, 2009, and the evaporation of dollar capital there. And what are some of the solutions is to get rid of people. And Nicaragua turns around and says, oh, well, the United States has been no friend to us. Fly him to Managua, drop him off at the airport here, and we'll point him north. And so the United States has been furious with Nicaragua for allowing flights of Chinese, Indian, people from all over the world, and sending them north. And there has been a low level, fight between the United States and Nicaragua because of that insecurity. And a lot of that also is carried out by non-governmental organizations, NGOs, and also by churches. I mean, churches are in some way the original NGO, or maybe the original GO. So Nicaragua, several months, and also to add a little bit of backstory in this too, is the Catholic Church was part of the Catholic Church was part of, in their eyes, part of the problem, part of the Spanish colonial rule. And so if you go down to Central American countries today, you're going to find a lot of Assembly of God churches, a lot of other evangelical and charismatic churches, And those churches were adopted and grew in power because of complaints about Spanish colonialism and Mexican colonialism and just, I mean, imperialism writ large. I mean, the Catholic Church is controlled from Rome, not from the Americas, and certainly not from Managua. So, so Nicaragua has long been, I don't know, dubious or um, I would just say dubious of out of religions and NGOs. And so in I believe it was somewhere around a year ago, they deported 222 members of the American Church, and I don't have the full details of the American Church, um, but this goes to um, I don't know. When I saw it happen, I just thought, well, this is Nicaragua's reaction and expulsion of American influence. And yesterday or this morning, they released 135 political quote unquote prisoners to Guatemala, and I would say that has everything to do with the further souring of relations between Daniel Ortega and the United States. And I would say that that has been ratcheted up by the United States, the growing the growing interest that the United States has in our southern neighbors as we have fiascos in Asia and in China, Russia, and I mean China, Russia slash the Ukraine and Israel slash the Middle East. So this is why I think the United States um, has been so concerned with the Venezuelan election. I don't think it has to do with our concern for democracy, because we just use democracy as a narrative, an excuse to install leaders who are going to play ball with the United States. And so,
And so what happened yesterday is just a continuation of this sort of tensions and like what's going on there. So this 135 uh, political prisoners who were released. This is I'm still not entirely tying together what the significance of this event is. So these prisoners, um, they're released to the U.S. or like what is going on here particularly? Because it's not entirely clear where they're going or who they're being released from yet. I mean, I got the backstory. I think I've got the big picture here, but tell us a little bit more about what happened yesterday.
so well, I don't have all the details on all of these prisoners yet, but in large part they were associated with a church there called the American Church, and that American Church was part of a congregation out of Houston called the Mountain View Church, and also Catholic nuns and priests. And no, they were not released to the United States. In With the last release of 222 of the members of that church, they were released in the United States. But now, as we get really close to the election, I would guess that the State Department or the federal government of the United States, the Biden administration, did not want, but both wanted the release of those former Nicaraguans, which, by the way, Nicaragua also rescinded. We talked about the man without a country, and the political solutions of not just imprisoning somebody but kicking them out of your country. The Nicaraguan government stripped the citizenship off of those 222 Nicaraguans whenever they sent them to the United States last year, and probably did so with the 135 political prisoners that they were holding that they released to Guatemala. And so no, they did not release them to the United States because that would not look good for the United States, but for the Biden administration leading into an election that in which immigration is so hotly contested, to be accepting a massive group of people from a country that doesn't necessarily share our border, and we may not. Most Americans don't even know where it's at. So instead, the political detente was to put them into Guatemala. Who knows what the United States gave to Guatemala to talk them into taking those Nicaraguans on behalf of the United States.
Very interesting.
Yeah. So I guess, and thanks for thank you for listening to my I don't know, spiel or my concerns about Nicaragua. But I think we in the United States need to be um, aware of American imperialism, especially when it comes home. Like we talk a lot about the Monroe Doctrine, and talking about the Monroe Doctrine with regards to China or Russia, um, or Africa. A lot of those various those regions have turned around and say, yes, we absolutely agree with the Monroe Doctrine, and you need to be exerting your influence uh, with your neighbors, with Canada and Mexico, Central and South America, and you need to get out of the Eastern Hemisphere. And our neighboring countries have been both, I would say, fearful and preparing for the United States' attention to shift away from our global control, and as we lose the power of the soft power of the United States dollar being held as the world reserve currency, and the devastating effects of sanctions that we have applied to various countries all around the world um, to also incite political regime change, and install people, politicians that were favorable to the United States interests. They've been preparing for it, and that's part of the immigration quote unquote problem that we have here in the United States, but is going to bring more of those countries and um, our history and of relations and the things that have happened to the fore, um, as as we have to, I don't know, as we have to be aware of, and also you know go forward in a world in which we are not exerting American influence that we don't see through the dollar. And you brought up John Bolton earlier, and I talked about neocons and this idea that the American military is always powerful. I mean, this also goes back to Teddy Roosevelt, speak softly and carry a big stick. Well, um, think about how has the war in the Ukraine and Israel gone with us? Because we are also moving into a a world in which technology is dispersed and guerrilla tactics, and this is nothing new. I mean, the United States won the American Revolutionary War because we weren't close to Britain, and because they didn't care as much, and mercenaries didn't care as much. Um, and that, I would say, has only grown with the growth and advent of new technologies. And so the United States, in during the Cold War, with our outsized military equipment and outsized technology, bigger may have been better at one time, but the Yemen have been devastating to United States military or naval power with the use of drones. And so I think it's very important for the United States to realize that going down a path of always relying on might is 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 possibly a dangerous path for everyone. I mean, I don't know that there are any. I don't know offhand if there are any nuclear powers in Central and South America, but Nicaragua, going back also to their lake and the canal, they have um, they have many construction projects. They're probably their primary trade partner is China, and Daniel Ortega talks. He talks a lot about the good that the Chinese have done for Nicaragua. The difference in um, the the bona fides from the United States versus other countries in the world, especially China, a little bit with Japan. And so the United States isn't going to get away with just bullying their neighbors um, in a new world in which we are looking closer to home to further to further I don't know, pay for our extravagant way of life. So that's my thoughts on Nicaragua.
Yeah, it reminds me of a post that I saw recently on X. I was trying to see if I could find it, where it documented all of the different projects that the Chinese have been doing in Africa. It's a pretty surprising amount of development of seaports and whatever that they've been doing. So I I I I think we may at this point really be seeing a shift in the way that the United States is perceived as bullying other countries with, financial policy, interfering in elections, trying to peddle, this imperialist narrative, and then you have the Chinese that are doing something slightly different. And I think this is definitely a shifting of sand for the United States, and what the to see what happens over the next few years. This is going to be a very important election.
It is, and yeah, I hope that whoever wins the election um, begins to understand some of this. And China has not just built, China has built hospitals, they've built soccer stadiums, they've built roads, and they're not just doing it in Nicaragua, Costa Rica, Peru, Chile. They're doing it in Kazakhstan, and like their Silk Road initiative. Um, uh, that they have taken, they took a look at what the unite what some Americans were saying in the wake of World War II about using commerce to um, for a good neighbor policy, and they built heavily on that. And so they have both their Silk Road initiative and have been building both like ports. A lot of times they build like large infrastructure or
Yeah,
large.
did you see this post? Did this come across your feed at all?
No, I haven't seen that, but of course they were doing this in Africa, where the United States has long just been trying to take oil from Nigeria, and um, in, um, yeah, I'm not surprised about that at all. But wow, that's impressive. It's also very close to home from them, so and they have a large population, so they not only do they they build um, large projects in countries all over the world, but oftentimes they send the workers over to do so. And everyone talks here in the United States. Oh, China is buying land here, buying land there. China, like also well understands what sending a large group of people to work in a country does for the relations. And think about Ireland, Northern and Southern Ireland. Uh, sending a lot of English and Scottish people over to Ireland to live for a generation um, has has massive political impacts as people marry, live together, and get to be neighbors. So um, I don't know that that's a bad thing. Like I think China is very brilliant in their understanding of the power of commerce and the power of humanity in extending their view of the world and their domination. And we talk like everyone talks to, I don't know, communism this, communism that in China, but if you go back to the Opium Wars and the fight that the United States and Great Britain had over world trade and world dominance, and had on the on foreign land. um, I don't. Uh, I think we have. I think we have a lot to own up to, that we have not, with regards to our imperial policies. So that's
Well,
all.
interesting, topic today. Thanks for enlightening us. Sorry, I didn't have more to, give back and forth. This is a topic that I don't know that much about, so I feel like I've learned a lot. I didn't know as much about Nicaragua as I had hoped to come in on this topic, but I feel like we all learned quite a bit. So I really appreciate it, Lucas. Has been great.
Absolutely. Well, I enjoyed. I love talking about Nicaragua. Definitely, if you get a chance, go visit Ometepe Island. It's an amazing place. And I've never been to the Solomantine Islands, but I've long wanted to go there. There's a massive folk art community down there, and I don't. When I was in Ometepe Island 10 years ago, they didn't have electricity. They do now, but it was an amazing place to go live. It was being transported through time. And I don't. I think the Solomantine Islands have long um, have tried to avoid the grid, I guess. But the folk art on Solomantine Island is a fun rabbit hole to dive down to on the internet sometimes. So highly recommend it.
All right. Well, we'll see you tomorrow.